All right, guys, just gonna go over the differences between primary and secondary sources with you. I know that you are required to have both kinds of sources in your National History Day project. You may have an idea of what primary and secondary sources are, but I feel like I need to do a little bit of explaining. That way, there's no confusion as to the differences. To begin, we need to understand why we use sources and what sources are. While we research, historians use two types of sources. They use primary and secondary sources. And the use of sources is to gather information and to analyze information. Um, for the most part, the sources that we use in class are secondary sources. For example, our textbook, that's a secondary source. It's a secondhand account of history. Um, a lot of the information you're going to get for your NHD project is from secondary sources. Most websites are secondary. The trick is to finding those primary sources. Those are more difficult to find and they're more difficult to analyze. But once you get them, they're going to give you a ton of amazing information to include in your project. So, what are the differences between the two? A primary source is a firsthand account of history. When I think of primary sources, I think of I was there, like somebody telling me about a historical event that they witnessed, an eyewitness account. They're they're most often created during the time period that's being studied, but sometimes they can be created after. Some examples of primary sources include artifacts like coins, fossils, tools, clothing, weapons can be considered primary, or yeah, it can be considered primary sources. Diaries or journal entries, autobiographies, letters, speeches, newspaper articles that were written at the time, magazine articles that were written at the time. Those are considered primary sources. Original documents like wills, birth certificates, trial transcripts, marriage licenses, um, titles to land, bank statements, those are all considered primary sources because they are original documents. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are secondhand accounts of history. They try to describe or explain a primary source or a historical event. When you're making a secondary source, you oftentimes look up a series of primary sources and piece them together in order to create a narrative about an event that occurred. Secondary sources are typically created after a historical event has occurred. Some examples of secondary sources, these are the most common things that you use during a school day. Textbooks, websites, encyclopedias, magazine and newspaper articles, and biographies. Note that both primary and secondary sources have some sort of biographies in them. An autobiography is a primary source because an autobiography was written by the person that the book is about. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., he may have written an autobiography about himself. If he's the author, it's an autobiography. But if I were to write a book about Martin Luther King Jr., it would not be considered an autobiography. It would be considered a biography. It's a tiny difference, but it's a difference nonetheless. It's important to recognize that when you are deciding if a source is primary or secondary. Let's show what we know. A little quiz for you guys. I was watching ESPN, and one of the reporters said he had heard good reviews about a new sports movie. When he talks about the movie, what is the reporter? Is he a primary source or is he a secondary source? My friends and I found an old wedding dress in our attic. My father said it belonged to my grandmother. What is the dress? Is that dress a primary source or a secondary source? I found a series of journals, I should say journals, of a Civil War soldier at the local library. What kind of source do I have? Do I have a primary source or a secondary source? I found a letter to one of my friends in the locker room after school the other day. I know it's private, but I want to read it. What is the letter? Is it a primary source or a secondary source? At school, we use textbooks to learn about the history of the United States. When we use textbooks, what are we using? Are we using primary sources or are we using secondary sources? All right, hopefully that helped you guys out in differentiating the primary sources and secondary sources. Feel free to have ask me any questions about the differences between the two, but I hope you got a better understanding.